What about boys? How do they typically respond to puberty? Well, I wish there was as much information about this as there is for girls, but there isn't. So please don't think I spoke so much about the female experience simply because I am female. The closest analogy to a girl having her period for the first time would be the first time a boy ejaculates, which is known as seminarche. But there's very little research available on this for somewhat obvious reasons. It's not typically something a boy will talk to their parents about or their doctor because they don't have a need to. And because there is absolutely still a taboo in our society surrounding discussing any kind of masturbation, there is a social norm that you're not supposed to talk about it. And this is not typically something a doctor would ask about. It's not something they track. For those of you that are male, you might not know that it is an absolutely, completely standard question for any female for their doctor to ask them, when was the first day of your last period? It's an absolutely standard, typical question at every medical appointment. But it's not something a doctor typically asks a male of any age about ejaculation unless dealing with a health problem specifically related to it. Now, there have been 3 small studies conducted, and boys' reaction to ejaculation when it happens were mixed. Not surprisingly, they enjoyed the feeling because it felt good, it felt pleasurable, because it made them feel grown up. Some reported some guilt or shame, whether that's related to a religious belief or not, I don't know. And as I said, most girls in Western countries receive information about menstruation before it happens. But unfortunately, it's still very, very common for boys not to have their parents, including their dads, talk to them about seminarche. Absolutely, culture is going to have an influence here because there's a long history of being embarrassed or even being ashamed associated with masturbation in the West. Maybe this is why boys tend not to talk about it unless they're joking. Whether it's because of a wet dream, which is actually called a nocturnal emission and occurs without any manual stimulation at all, or because they've specifically caused it by masturbating. You know, even for those parents that try to talk to their male children about this openly, it's often without a lot of success. And you know, just for me, it seems pretty odd to me that in today's society, we can pretty much talk about anything and we're open, so socially speaking, to any kind of sexual variation, yet talking about masturbation is still something people kind of giggle at. And I mean, historically speaking, masturbation has been condemned by various religions, claiming that it inhibits self-control, that it will encourage people to be sexually promiscuous, and that it will, or that when somebody masturbates, it eliminates the need, not the need, it eliminates the possibility for reproduction. So, when we're looking at puberty, part of how a person responds to their own puberty depends on when it happens. If you seem to be kind of generally on time or off time. Now, as I've already said, there's a lot of things that are going to affect this. But timing of puberty is also affected in some ways by genetic factors. Genetics seems to be the number one factor, and everything else will also have an influence. If you're female, the age at which your mother started to menstruate is going to strongly predict yours. If you have sisters, when they experienced menarche, that's going to be strongly correlated with you, and correlations are especially high among twin sisters. Now, when I spoke about how in traditional cultures there's often rituals and rites that a young person goes through at puberty, I want you to recognize something, and that is that these are not based on age. These rituals and rites are based on physical development. So for a girl, it's when she starts menstruating because that's a specific event. It's not based on her age. And for boys, for whom it's not based on a specific event, it's still not based on age. It's typically based on their maturity. If the adults in the community feel that a boy is ready to begin to be recognized more as an adult, then they will be. So in these cultures, a person's age doesn't really matter. Everybody will get there eventually, but there's still a general expectation of when they should get there. And it isn't like that in Western cultures, is it? Because here, a person's chronological age is much more significant in regards to when we begin to view them less as a child, in part because of how our school system operates. We live in an age-graded society. So we know that in Canada, in the 7th grade, for example, students will be between 12 to 13 years old. But that doesn't mean all of them will be at the same stage of puberty. Some girls have their period by the start of grade 7, some don't. Some are noticeably developing breasts, some aren't. If you think of junior high school, grade 7 and 8, some boys are developing more muscle and they just look more masculine, whereas some really have that round baby face. And to me, grades 7, 8, and 9 are very clear examples of this because it's not unusual to see a huge difference, for example, in one classroom in terms of height and very feminine or very masculine characteristics. But grouping young people together like this by age can also have a negative effect because it's not a neutral arrangement. For those who have yet to undergo any noticeable changes due to puberty, this can be problematic because it highlights differences in development. At the same time, those who are a little bit advanced, it might be problematic for them. So, for example, a boy in grade 9 who is still really, really, really short compared to everybody else, including the girls, or a girl who is still flat as a board and no breast development at all, and she's in grade 10 or 11, when everybody else has been wearing real bras, not just training bras, for a few years. So every day they go to school and they compare themselves to everybody else, and everybody else compares them to everybody else. So they can become really hypersensitive to the fact that yes, they're on time regarding their development, or no, they're not. Because every day you have all of these examples around you of where society tells you you should be in terms of your pubertal timing. Not to mention the social pressures associated with the way kids talk and tease each other. And this can create a great deal of stress, anxiety, a feeling of not measuring up, of being faulty in some way, a negative body image, a negative self-image overall. If you look specifically, for example, at for girls, if they develop early or late, there's really no positive effects of beginning to go through puberty early for girls. Instead, and keep in mind, these are just tendencies, these are not absolutes, but instead, the effects of early maturation for girls has suggested to be negative because it puts them at risk of higher risk for eating disorder, having a more negative body image, an increased chance of problems at school, increased chance of problems with their parents. And again, keep in mind that these studies are subjective and these are not absolute conclusions. Another reason that girls who mature early sometimes experience difficulties associated with it is because this early physical development can draw the attention of boys, which at that point is something they haven't experienced before. So it's new, it's unusual, and it can, in some studies, lead to earlier sexual activity. What about boys? Unlike girls, the effects of developing earlier for boys tend to be positive. Boys who mature early tend to have a more favorable image of themselves, and their peers tend to have a more favorable image of them. So they're often more popular than other boys, maybe because this growth spurt in height and muscle development gives them an advantage in athletics. And, in middle school and high school, athletics are often considered something important. But I mean, even just apart from being in adolescence, for men in general in our culture, height and physical presence tend to be viewed as things that are valued. Looking masculine is considered positive. Early development for boys also means developing facial hair, that their voice will change earlier. They simply look more masculine. If we look at later maturation for girls and boys, and these pictures here on the computer, these are all boys of the same age in the same class, so you can see the difference. Later maturing girls tended to not experience the kind of issues that early maturing girls do, although, of course, there may be teasing and a lack of confidence. Later maturing boys sometimes report having lower grades and elevated levels of substance abuse right into adulthood. But to summarize, how early or late a boy or a girl starts puberty and how it proceeds differs. And in terms of the effect of culture, unfortunately, nearly all research in this area has focused on Western cultures with Caucasian kids. So it would be really interesting to see how that would change with a cross-cultural comparison regarding being on time or not and how different cultures react to it. Excuse me. So the last main thing I'm going to talk about for this chapter is something I know you've heard about before, although the chapter uses a different term for it, commonly known as the nature-nurture debate, but in the context of this course in the textbook, referred to as the theory of genotype environmental effects. All this means is, for adolescents, where do they get their abilities from? What is going to have the most effect on somebody, their genetics or their environment? And this debate has been going on for decades. The importance of biology versus the importance of the environment regarding development. Some people favor the nature side, feeling that human behavior and development can be solely explained based on genetics. Other people would say, yeah, of course genetics is going to play a part, but don't downplay the effect of the environment. Most acknowledge that both are relevant. So for this course, this is referred to as the theory of genotype environmental effects, saying both have an effect, but at the same time, realize that genetics is going to influence your environment. And this occurs in three ways: passive, evocative, and active. So the passive genotype environmental effect, this is a situation that occurs in biological families. So both parents are biologically related to the children. And because of that, how can you look at those kids and say, this is caused by genetics or this is caused by the environment when both are present? So I know it seems obvious. Yes, Jennifer, in a biological family, you get your genes from your parents and they create the environment as well. But I want you to consider this from the point of view of development. So let's say you have a dad who is an artist, and as a kid, he always liked to draw. As an adult, he actually makes his living as an artist. He illustrates book covers, let's say. And one of the first things he does with his little girl is give her a kid's artist kit, with a little toddler-sized easel and big pieces of paper and colored pencils and stuff. And she likes it. And as she gets older, she begins to draw more and more, and her skills gradually improve. And so her dad's always giving her all different kinds of papers and brushes and paints and different mediums to use to create art. In high school, she takes art classes all the way through, and she eventually goes to university for architecture. And then as a hobby, she does watercolor paintings on the side. So what caused this? Nature or nurture? Yes, she was provided a lot of opportunity in her environment to become interested in art and drawing. She was encouraged socially, but at the same time, she has her dad's genes and thus has maybe an inherited interest and an inherited ability. So how can we determine how much environmental influence there was and how much genetic influence there was? Well, we can't, because she was provided with both. And both reinforced these artistic tendencies and encouraged development of artistic skills. Adoption studies can shed at least a little light on this because they avoid the whole passive genotype environmental effect issue. Because clearly, when a child is adopted, you have one set of parents who determine the genotype and another set of parents who determine the environment. So in these situations, if you have an adopted child who's more similar to their adoptive parents, well then this supports the idea that environment has a really significant effect. But if the adopted child turns out to be more similar to their biological parents, then that will support the idea that genes are a significant contributor to behavior and development. So that's the first one. Second one is evocative genotype environmental effects. And what this says is that the person's genes, what they inherit, encourages certain responses from their environment. So let's say you have a kid who is obsessed with learning to play the guitar. You might sign them up for guitar lessons. If you have a daughter who loves to play basketball, you might buy a net for your house and sign her up for a city league and send her to a basketball camp in the summer. So they have some kind of inherited ability, and because of that, they are evoking a response from the environment. They are causing their environment to react in a certain way. If the son who was obsessed with learning to play the guitar, let's say it wasn't the guitar, well then the environment, meaning the people around him, his context, wouldn't be responding to him in that way. If he was hyper interested in art and really was kind of chasing after that, then he would cause that kind of response from his environment. And then the last one is the active genotype environmental effect. This you can see, I think, quite clearly in adolescence. And this is when people seek out environments that respond to their genotype characteristics. So, again, you've got a kid who likes to play all kinds of sports. So what do? They seek out sports-oriented environments. So they're going to constantly want to be playing pickup games of hockey and basketball. They're going to be joining sports teams at school. That's what they're going to gravitate towards. So when I say that this active genotype environmental effect, people seek out environments, they're going to gravitate to the environment that supports, coincides with, that encourages, that fits with the inherited or the active genotype that they have. A kid who likes to read will always be asking for books. A kid who likes nature or science will always be asking to go to the zoo or to, I don't know, have lots of pets in the house. So as these people get older, as they continue and they develop into an emerging adult, they're going to be drawn to these environments that match their inherited abilities. Now, all three kinds of these effects are present during childhood, adolescence, and emerging adulthood. But the balance of them shifts over time, which makes sense. So in childhood, when your parents control your daily environment, you don't have a lot of separation from your parents. You frankly don't have a lot of control. So the environmental influence outside your family is very small. That means your passive genotype is going to be especially strong. But as you get older, you begin to go through adolescence. You slowly but surely begin to develop more and more independence from your parents. You become more autonomous, and you begin to seek out environments that correspond to your genotype characteristics. So during adolescence, the active genotype becomes stronger. And for both of these periods, the evocative usually remains steady throughout. So when I look at this theory, to me, it just seems to be a different way of stating what we already know. And I don't want to detract from it when I say that, but I always like to reduce what I'm looking at to its simplest form to understand it better. When you're younger and spend the majority of your time with your parents, they are going to have the most influence on you. To me, that makes sense. So of course the passive genotype environmental effects equation will apply here more, because your parents provide both genes and the environment for you. But this also makes it difficult to separate which has more of an effect. All your influence comes from your parents, but is it their genes or their socialization? So for example, I have a friend who is an artist. He grew up on the same street from me, just a couple doors down. And he's a working artist. He teaches at the Ontario College of Art and Design. He teaches at Durham College. He sells his own art. He's traveled internationally on teaching programs. So he's an arty person. And his children are exactly the same. Why? It's because he always has art supplies around the house. Because his garage is an artist studio. You just walk through the door and everything's there. Because he talks about it a lot, because it affects the way he sees the world, that his boys are very similar? Or is it because of genes? And the theory of genotype environment is not universally accepted. It has been the subject of a lot of debate. For example, some people seriously question whether things like reading ability or athletic ability, or even how sociable a person is, are inherited. I read all the time. I always have. I was one of those kids who was often tired because I would stay up till 2 or 3 in the morning reading, and I still do. I have to set limits for myself, or I can barely get out of the bed in the morning. Is that because both of my parents were teachers, or because my mom always had books around that I'd be interested in, or is it genetics? In a roundabout way, do my genes have something to do with it because I am not athletic? Or could I have been more athletic if my parents had encouraged more of an interest that way? So the genotype environment theory is still an important theory of human development, even though it's kind of the old nature-nurture debate rephrased or repackaged. So let me just kind of pull this all together here. We looked at the difference between adolescence and puberty, that adolescence is a cultural construction and puberty is not. Little about the physical growth that occurs, asynchronicity, how the average age at menarche has steadily lowered until we can very safely say that puberty for both males and females, at least in Western countries, starts much earlier than it ever did before. We looked at the cultural response to menarche, how it is sometimes viewed as unclean, but other times viewed very positively. In developed countries, there tends to be a distinct distancing at puberty with young people and their parents. So we looked at the relationship between young kids and their parents. Boys have, or should I say, do not have a comparable experience to a girl getting her period for the first time. For them, the closest is when they ejaculate for the first time. But we simply don't have the same amount of research for boys that we do for girls. And I talked to you about the whole nature-nurture debate, otherwise known as the genotype environmental effect. So please take note that you will not be tested on physical functioning in emerging adulthood. That's simply not going to be something that you're responsible for your quiz or the final exam. But make sure you get your quiz done so you can keep up and not become behind with the course.